So, good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Joe. I am the OU-JLIC Rabbi at NYU at the Bronfman Center. I am so happy that you've all decided to join us. Thank you. Most of all, I am extremely excited and honored that we have with us Kylie and Aaron. Kylie and Aaron are two of the most wonderful people you could ever meet. The very first email that I ever received on the job, even before I'd arrived in America, whilst still living in Israel, was from Aaron. So our connection goes back a good way. Kylie as well, I've had the pleasure of knowing for a couple of years and getting to know better in recent period. So it's great to be here with everyone. I think this conversation, this event that we're going to have tonight, is one which should be relevant really at any time. It's going to touch upon questions of how the Jewish community makes space for a wide variety of members who share different backgrounds. It's going to touch upon race in America, and it's going to focus on the stories of individuals. And these are topics that are worthy of reflection at any time. However, the conversation tonight clearly has special relevance to the moment we find ourselves in. Since the murder of George Floyd in the week before Shavuot, this country and indeed the world has found itself dwelling upon the continued existence of racism in our societies in a way in which it has not done for many years. And it's pushed all of us to look at our own lives and our own communities and ask ourselves, what are we doing? What can we do to make sure that the worlds that we create and inhabit are really doing the best possible things on these matters and on these questions? I'm a rabbi in the Orthodox community, and of course, my vision is definitely partial. I see the world from where I'm positioned in it. I think I see a community which wants to be deeply involved in this moment and to educate itself and to hear more about it. At the same time, I think that many people have struggled to find the language to talk about these issues. Some people are afraid of speaking on subjects which perhaps they feel they are not qualified on. Others are concerned about anti-Semitism, of which there have been some painful examples in recent weeks from a small number of Black celebrities, and people concerned that that poisons the relationship between the Jewish community and the Black community, which should be one really of commonality and of seeing ourselves as having common goals, or at least working towards shared values. What we want to do tonight, and what I think is most important, is to really start with stories, to leave slogans behind, leave big pictures behind, and really focus on the individuals. I think that's the way in which everything starts. So the people we have with us tonight are Aaron and Kylie, Dr. Aaron Jordan. I just want to call a dentist doctor. I'm not sure. Do we, Aaron?
Technically, yes, but I'll just don't call me late to Kiddush.
We'll not call you late to Kiddush. Dr. Aaron Jordan, and soon to be Dr. Kylie Unell. Very proud that one thing that unites Aaron and Kylie is, of course, their affiliation with NYU. I'm going to give only the briefest of introductions to them because really they're going to give their own introductions. They're going to really tell us their own stories. But Aaron went to Williams College as an undergraduate. He grew up in Harlem and graduated in 2018 from NYU Dentistry. During that time, he worked towards his conversion, which I was happy to play a small role in, and today lives in Englewood with his wonderful wife, Talia, who is the head of the Hillels of New Jersey, I believe, and also with their beautiful baby, Levi. Kylie went to NYU as an undergraduate, and before that grew up in Jewish communities across America and spent significant time in Israel. She's done a lot of interesting things after finishing her undergraduate degree and still does a lot of interesting things, but is now back at NYU where she is doing her PhD in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies. So I said it's about stories, and stories allow us to get beyond the headlines and the slogans and begin to know individuals and understand about their lives. That's what we're doing tonight. And I think it's really important that we don't just have Kylie here and we don't just have Aaron here, but rather we've got both of them. And the reason for that is because no one story is alike. There is not one experience of being Black, there's not one experience of being Jewish, there's not one experience of being Black and Jewish. In a combination of their stories, I hope we're going to get something of the nuance of understanding how every person's experience is different. So in order to get the ball rolling, we'd love it if you both could tell us a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing to start the evening. So Aaron, would you begin for us?
Sure. So thank you so much, Rabbi Joe, for the beautiful introduction already. Just to back up, so hi guys, I'm Aaron Jordan. Like Rabbi Joe said, I did grow up in Harlem. My family, we did move all around New York, but mostly it was in Harlem. It's just significant stuff. Like I was, born and raised in the city, went to Beacon High School, then went to Williams College where I met Talia. I converted to Judaism when I first started in OU Dental. During that time, I had an amazing experience getting the halakha down, just learning some more, putting it into practice, and just doing that while also learning some dentistry. So it was crazy, but it was absolutely beautiful, and wouldn't have had it any other way. So now I'm married with my 1 year and 2 month son, and we're in Englewood with my mother-in-law. My sister-in-law actually is also here with all of us, so we're all just one happy big family. So when I was specifically talking about my upbringing, that's just a general overview. My father had gone through basically like the crack epidemic because he had also been in Harlem, and what he had done was took my brother and I aside for essentially what I kind of would know as the talk that his father had told him. Specifically, when we were in his car, he would have us go through these drills of having us put our hands on the dashboard when interacting with police, and this is also after Mr. Diabolo, who got shot because he had taken out his wallet when police had thought that he was a rape suspect. So my father basically had told us to kind of telegraph our movements, that kind of thing. Obviously to still be cordial and respectful, but just to kind of make sure that everyone knew what we would be doing in a traffic stop. So that kind of thing. Specifically, also like being kind of Black in the inner city, I wouldn't, he said you can't go out at night. It's just not safe. We don't know what's going to happen to you, and it's just, you have a curfew, so just come right back home. You're also not allowed to wear a hoodie, especially at night. We just don't want anyone thinking that, you're up to something or whatnot. So no hoodies. And if specifically, if it's like evening time, to not to cross the street if you're behind someone who's white, specifically like white women, just to make sure that no one feels threatened, or it's just that everyone feels safe, so that because essentially the situation could escalate, and unfortunately that has happened. And so I was just kind of prepped with a lot of these preemptive measures. It's just so that I would not. Basically to minimize the chance of anything happening to me. So I was kind of, unfortunately, a large part of my childhood, and something that, has kind of stayed with me. And that was just part of my experience, other than just, going to school and living my day to day.
Okay, well, I guess it means it's my turn. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I feel like I'm as excited to be a participant as I am to hear what somebody else has to say about all of this, and to be in conversation and dialogue with somebody else is a really unique experience. So I'm as much of an audience member as everybody else here, I think. So my name is Kylie Unell. I was born and raised in Overland Park, Kansas, which is a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. I always forget this. So my story is vastly different, I'd say, than Aaron's in some ways, just in that I've only known the Jewish community. So when somebody asks me to talk about my life, I forget about the fact that I am the product of an interracial couple. My mom is white and my dad is Black. I don't even think about it. So but I guess for the purposes of this conversation, it's an important thing to add. So I grew up in Overland Park, Kansas, and I went to a Jewish school. I grew up there's a pretty large Jewish community. I think for New York Jews, or New Yorkers in general, I won't say Jews only. There's New York, there's LA, and there's everything in the middle. I'm from that middle part, and in that middle part, there's 20,000 Jews, where I'm from in particular. So it's a little bit bigger than just the middle part. It might be 18,000 now. I haven't lived there for a while. But when I was 11 years old, my family made Aliyah. My parents got divorced when I was about 5. So I was raised with my mother and 2 sisters. And my mom is, like, if you look up badass in the dictionary, she's, is right there. She moved her kids to Modi'in, Israel, because she wanted us to have a better Jewish experience than America had to offer, largely, but particularly Kansas City. She was born and raised in Kansas, and she wanted something different. So we moved to Israel. I grew up in a pretty, traditional home. We were, I'd say, conservadox. My mom has been very spiritually grounded my entire life, which I think is the thing that defines my Judaism more than anything. Her Judaism has always been very God-centric. I think that's something that's very left out of a lot of Orthodox communities and in Jewish education, the role of God. So I didn't think of the label, what Judaism I fit under. I was just a Jew, and we said Shema every night and 3 things that you're grateful for. And she cultivated a very close personal relationship with God. That defined my Judaism. When I was about 16, we moved back to America because the education standards weren't quite where my mom wanted them to be in Israel. We went back to Kansas, then moved to North Carolina because there's a Jewish school there, American Hebrew Academy, a boarding school that's now closed. So I attended that school. As a backup, the public school had Hebrew offering. So if the private school didn't work out, there's Hebrew as a backup. So my entire life has been guided by where can I be raised with the richest Jewish life? And my mom chased that wherever she could. And so I was raised with the mentality that you sacrifice, you do not settle for anything less than a stellar Jewish community and a great Jewish education, because otherwise you have no chance. So I went to college after Greensboro. I came to NYU, I studied American Jewish history. My sisters were still in high school and they were at the public school actually. And my mom said, well, this is dumb. I didn't move around the world for my kids to just end up at a public school and doing BBYO. So they moved back to Israel and then traveled around Europe homeschooling. So whatever you do in life, you do it to the nth degree, and you do everything with Judaism and with God in mind. And that was the mentality that I was raised with. I have since worked in the Jewish nonprofit sphere. I worked for an organization called the Tikva Fund, Jewish Review of Books, Mosaic Magazine, all of the above. And then 3 years ago, going to my 3rd year of grad school, I started a master's degree in Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and I'm starting a PhD officially in German Jewish philosophy in the fall, so that period that's already started. And I also started an organization to create strong bases for millennial Jews. I just want them all loving Judaism, and I think I have a recipe for that. So I started an organization to do that. So we'll see what happens, but that's my life and that's me.
Thank you so much, Kylie, and thank you, Aaron, as well. I'm sure that the last few months have been incredibly intense and probably quite surreal for you both. You weren't expecting that suddenly having black skin would mean that you would rise to the top of the national agenda and alongside questions of racial justice. If you could just share with us a little bit, if you can distill a little bit, what have been some of your feelings in this period?
So I'll take that first. So it's been a fascinating period for me. I think we see these periods happen. I've seen these periods happen throughout my life. This has been the most intense period of my lifetime, for sure. It's been, nothing happens on my time, and all happens on God's time. So just the interest in me and my story happening at this particular time has also been something that's just a higher concentration of that than I've ever experienced before. And I wrote an article on, which we'll talk about a little later, on being somebody who is seen as a Jew of color in the Jewish community. And that on top of everything just added a lot to it. So my opinion was already being asked about. And then on top of that, I kind of fueled the flame a little bit. But I mean, it's interesting because I think right now we're in the height of social media activism. We're in the height of a world where people are really fueled to defend a particular cause when it's a hot topic. And then you give it a few months, it fades away, then God forbid, unfortunately, something else happens and that comes back to life. So I think it's been particularly heightened during the summer because it's just everything is hit the fan in its own way, right? We're in quarantine, we had riots, there was a black man who was killed unjustifiably. So all of these things mixed together at one time just created a situation that could not have been predicted. And it's been the most interesting experience being somebody who is of a media that is very driven by social media. So I think in some ways it's been made bigger because there was so much social media response to it. And that's probably been the most interesting thing to navigate, to see the ups and downs of this period, because I think they've really followed ups and downs as I've sort of traced and tracked it.
Thanks, Kylie. How about you, Aaron?
So for me, it's honestly really a mixed bag. I would say that not much has changed in terms of for my experiences, living as a Black man, as a Black person in America. I think George Floyd is just unfortunately the latest of this really miserable, really sad saga of being a victim of police brutality and systemic racism, honestly, in the US. So I remember when I first heard about Sean Bell. I remember when I heard about Amo Diablo. I remember about, it's just Freddie Gray. It's just,
These are names from your childhood, right?
Yeah, and not just from the childhood, but from also growing up. It's almost been a couple of years, then someone's killed, and then it's we're pausing, and then just a short time later, it happens again under different circumstances. And I think George Floyd is unfortunately, it's good because we have a great conscience and it can see, I guess, the public execution of what actually had happened, which is very disturbing. But bad because, I could have not necessarily predicted this, but I knew we were headed that way when I was seeing the Freddie Gray video of someone being choked out for allegedly selling loose cigarettes. I mean, it was horrible. It was horrible, and I want to say, I'm angry and sad because obviously this is we're still not really, in my opinion, making any kind of systemic changes. I like the fact that they're held accountable. I like the fact that we're definitely recording and we're definitely paying more attention to this. But I think that also we have some ways to go to have his name, and so many people like him to be the last of the experience, because, unfortunately, I think this is going to happen again. Because if we're not really there in terms of changing the system of, what's been happening in this country. I mean, if you just look at the video, I was like watching it, I'm like, the officers is essentially killing him, right, by like in putting him in this hold, and the other officers standing around, and it's like no one can feel that, like everyone kind of knows it's wrong, but no one can feel like they can stand up and like stop this. And so as long as we have that kind of like aura and environment where it's like clearly something's wrong, but we can't do something to fix it, I think that always will be like a, you know, there's something deeply like messed up here. I mean, so it's like that's it. It's like it's good because we're kind of like, yes, we're better because, you know, people are caring about it more and whatnot, and people are seeing, oh, for sure, like there's a problem in this country, rather than Freddie Gray. It was more like a victim blaming kind of thing, like, oh, why was he selling cigarettes, and more about his character as a thug. And I'm like, well, what does that have to do about him being placed in a chokehold and saying I can't breathe and no one doing anything? Like, you know, like what does that have to do with anything? And then, but so now we're reaching there, but I feel like, you know, it's still not there where I can be like, wow, we're really kind of, we're there, or we're getting there where people can, you know, really get like due process, right? Of just not being tried and executed, you know, just because they had fit a description or just had honestly just been a black man of color. Just
so you started off by saying it's been a mixed bag. Where's the mixed in the positive element? Like
the positive in that people are taking it seriously, and that people are not doing the victim blaming. Positive that the officers were arrested, and I guess that people are talking about it and being serious about it. So that's really what's been positive, rather with Freddie Gray, like it was everyone just victim blaming Freddie and not really having this conversation. I feel like it was just kind of a, you know, spike, that kind of thing. So I feel like we're obviously having this conversation because people care.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, both of you. So I think of you, and I'm pretty sure everyone else who knows you both thinks of you as super Jews, and that's no exaggeration. I used to joke with some of the other guys at the dental school that if you were ever not sure, you know, about the bracha on a certain food, it was Aaron who you asked, and indeed he was their address. You know, you astonished me with Daf Yomi. Kylie, my grandfather was, my great-grandfather was a rabbi in Germany, but you know far more about German Jewish rabbis than I do, and I probably ever will. Is there something that you could share, each of you, that sort of really captures for you the essence of what being Jewish means for you? Perhaps a practice or a tradition that you love, or an experience that you've had? Kylie, would you have anything which would fit that description?
Yeah, I think for me, coming to the study of Jewish philosophy was the thing that brought me closest to what Judaism is and should be, and the healthiest understanding of it. I went into college thinking I would go into politics. I've since moved very far away from that, both in my own heart and mind, but also just in terms of what I'm actually doing. I think academia, if it's done right, is very far from politics. But when I studied, I had one class at NYU, and it was Judaism in America. It was taught by this man named Professor Micha Gottlieb. He's actually my advisor right now in grad school. But that class was the first one that I'd ever seen the intersection between my American identity and my Jewish identity. I'd read a book called America's Prophet by Bruce Feiler, and he talked about the story of Moses and the influence that story and the story of the Israelites moving towards the promised land and being in the desert, how that is mirrored in America, all the way from the Pilgrims to the gay rights movement, and how the story of Moses has really influenced that and become a part of our national narrative. If you go to, I think it's the Senate chambers, Moses is looking down on you. So there's something very Jewish about America. And seeing that intersection was the most exciting thing to me. But then to take it a step further and to understand Jewish thought, I was able to see that there's no one way to do Judaism. There's no one way to be Jewish. We're all trying to figure it out every single day. And there's a certain crop of Jewish thinkers who have come up to say, well, this is how I think we should do it. This is what I think God is. This is how I think we should relate to God. Like, everything's a question. And that was the first time I'd ever seen people talking in that language, and grappling with that. It was also the first time I'd ever heard God talked about. So I grew up listening to gospel music, completely separate from my color. My mom just loved anything that had the message of God in it. So I grew up listening to gospel music, Joel Osteen, the televangelist, as much as like Abraham Fried songs. Is a beautiful mix. But reading about people coming up with their theories about what God is, what Judaism is, the role it's meant to play in the world, opened up an entire world for me to be able to question my surroundings and come to Judaism in my own way, and figure out how to mesh who I am with what I believe, with what other people believe, and just find the thing that I connect to the most. So the book that had the biggest influence on me was The 19 Letters, reading that in college. It's by Samson Raphael Hirsch. That's who I'm doing my dissertation on now. But it was the book that showed me that you can question things, and that we can put things in a way, we can understand what the Torah is through just like human terms. The Torah is the book telling the story of the Jewish people. Great, now I understand that boring part in Devarim, or like wherever it is, like wherever there's a boring part, I get it now. It's part of the founding of a people. So reading Jewish thought opened up my world and came to give me a definition of what Judaism is, which is constantly moving.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. How about you, Aaron?
So this is pretty, like, it's really hard. Sorry, I have like this thing just popping up. It's hard to like narrow down like one specific practice, because just so much about Judaism is amazing for me. Like, I mean, specifically some of the things that, like, when Todd was introducing me to Judaism, about how like there are so many, like more than 70 faces of Torah, the fact that we have to, you read the Torah and like you keep on rereading, and it's a constant renewal process of just like looking and looking again. The fact that we have purpose in this world, that God cares about us, that we care about God, we have a responsibility, God has a responsibility of us. It's like, part of those are part of the reasons why I knew that being Jewish was meant for me. But just to kind of crystallize like one practice, I guess, would be that I guess that for me being Jewish is that we have purpose in this world, and that we also have a responsibility, and we're also interconnected because we're all created in the image of God. Specifically, one practice that I've really appreciated and I've really loved is actually giving tzedakah. When I was growing up, specifically around like inner city Harlem and walking around, I was kind of taught that people who were experiencing homelessness were like either drug addicts, or that they like that if you give them money that they'll waste it or they'll use it on drugs or whatnot. Like I had walked around with a very, I guess, cynical, or I wouldn't look at people as people, as human. But part of what attracted me about Judaism is that, specifically modern Orthodox Judaism, is that the rabbis spent a lot of time creating a lot of laws and diverse laws for legislating like how much to give, and more importantly, how to give, so that we can uphold human dignity. And so that you notice, you never are not noticing people on the margins. You're kind of keeping people and their humanity in front of you. And you know that you have like responsibility to them because they're your brother, they're your neighbor, they're a fellow human being. They're also created in the image of God as you. And so like that's like that like really stuck with me, and that's one of the best things I love about Judaism.
Can I just say I'm so excited to be here. This is just so much fun. Every answer I'm just like, this is so great. You can keep going. I just had to say that. I think there you go.
Really, we just put on this whole event so that Kylie and Aaron could get to know everyone else is just the excuse for that. Thank you both. So I think that you've both got a really valuable and important role to play for the Jewish community at this moment, because you sit at the intersection of these two identities. And part of the reason, like I said at the start, why it's so valuable for us to have this evening with both of you is that your personal stories are so different from one another. there's no one version of being a Black member of the Jewish community. So before we get on to some perhaps more abstract or philosophical thoughts, is there an anecdote or a moment you can share that captures something of your story of being Black and Jewish? Have you experienced overt prejudice, other attitudes which you encounter which are more subtle or subconscious in their prejudice? Or perhaps is this actually not the correct frame at all for looking at it, describing your experiences? Aaron, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I guess just in summary, like, yes, there are both moments where I experience overt prejudice and also more kind of subtle types. So like when I walk into a new shul or like a kosher restaurant or kind of any predominantly Jewish spaces, I not only feel that eyes are on me, I also have like kind of looked around and yes, eyes are on me. And many people kind of assume that, you know, when I'm walking in that I'm not Jewish, or have done like what I kind of call a kippah check, like, hey, like, is this guy like wearing kippah, or like what's going on here? You know, sometimes they just ask me, you know, right off the bat, or, you know, sometimes these deeply personal questions, and I'm like, hey, you don't even know my name. Like, we're not even there yet. So, you know, I guess an anecdote would be like Jewish geography as like the more can be subtle. Sometimes I've had it in the overt ways, and I'll kind of explain how it's been used for both for me. So you know, Jewish geography, as we all know or don't know or whatever, it's like as a way, it's something that I've learned is just a kind of like an interconnected tool. So it's like everyone feels connected because they know someone from like this yeshiva who went there, and so like we really like we know each other, we just don't know it yet. So it's like, you know, like I know you because I went to school with you who went to whatever, blah, blah, blah. So, right. So that's how the game's played. So, but, you know, if you don't have kind of those connections, like if you didn't go to yeshiva, whatnot, then it's, you kind of fail the game, I guess. I don't know. It's like you kind of lose or you don't, I don't know. But sometimes it's used as like, as a way to just say, like to get, like, I guess to, you know, furrow out my convert status of just saying, hey, like what yeshiva did you go to? Like, that's like the second question. Like, oh, then what your name is? Like the yeshiva is just for me to basically say, hey, I didn't go to yeshiva. I converted, whatnot. So that's kind of that. But a more overt story is, so I'm a dental resident at Jersey City. And when I first started davening at they have a Satmar shul there, and I had gotten looks at the very beginning. I had, you know, I'm a Black man walking into like a Satmar shul, as you can probably imagine. Like, so I heard, you know, one of the young children there for like, I think like either around Min Chamar or whatever, was talking to his father, and I had heard him say Schwarze, and I was like, wait, what? I just kind of felt a little out of place and different. Like I taken some German in Williams College, so I'm like, they're talking about me. And so the first time I went, like no one talked to me. Like everyone's kind of looking at me and kind of talking about me. And then I just kind of kept going back because they're the only minyan in town. And as I started to come back, they started like to talk to me and offer me coffee before davening. You know, even asking about their teeth and whatnot when they found out I was like a dentist and whatnot. So, you know, so we ended up building a rapport. But you know, it was awkward at first. And I know it's probably due to the fact that, you know, I look different.
Aaron, if I can ask you about the Jewish geography point, yeah. I think that, you know, you're quite right. Jews love to play Jewish geography, and I can imagine that people are sort of like, in some ways, torn, because on the one hand, you know, for very many people, when they ask those questions, it's genuinely a way of trying to be friendly, trying right. to, you know, work out a connection. Right. On the other hand, as you've described, it can also be very othering if you're not a part of those networks. So do you have any advice that you'd offer to people who meet somebody in Kiddush, they want to ask the questions, but they're not sure if they are, you know, do they upset them by asking them? What do you suggest?
Yeah, I would say to kind of build a rapport first, engage in like small talk so we can kind of like, don't have the like, I don't want people to overthink it, because I think that's the problem, right? If people overthink it and then they don't know, like, then they kind of then place a barrier, and then that you're creating more problems than you're solving. But I think if, small talk sometimes can be good. Sometimes we can just talk about other things, and then we can kind of then go into, these questions, and it makes it then seem like you're actually interested in finding a connection, rather than just trying to ferret out, either am I a convert, or like, descended from converts or whatnot. Like, please don't talk about Nissan Black. Like, I didn't know who that guy was. Okay. All right. Barring the fact that I actually did meet him, nice guy, but that's besides the point. But I was like, who is this guy? Everyone's saying, oh, have you heard of Nissan Black? I'm like, what's, and I say, oh, he's a Black rapper. I'm like, okay, like, he's a Black rapper who converted. I'm like, okay, great. That's the only two things that are like connect us. But it's like, then everyone, it's like, I got like that 50 times. I'm like, I like joked. I probably should like write a Post-it note. I was like, yes, I know who Nissan Black is, and that's our best friends, but like, whatnot. But I think that it, taking the time to ease it in, not necessarily avoiding the question, but just to make it feel like, you're using it to connect, rather than just trying to ferret out something or get personal information.
Right. Not the first question. I like that. Thank you. How about you, Kylie?
Well, it's so interesting because my experience is so the same but so different at the same time. So walking into Jewish restaurants or to kosher restaurants and feeling a certain way, or into a shul and feeling a certain way. But my mom is blonde, very blonde. She's beautiful. And she used to be a bodybuilder. She's in great shape. And she never did steroids, so she's a healthy looking bodybuilder. And she would always say, yeah, Kylie, I get those looks too. Like, I feel the same way walking into Jewish spaces. And I think it's really important to say, like, I've asked the Jewish geography questions about people and felt both that I was doing it to people who felt uncomfortable, and people have done it to me when I felt uncomfortable. Like, sure. I didn't go to seminary, and I came to NYU, and NYU is the epicenter. It's like, if people are from New York on this call, you'll know what I'm saying, but it's the 5 towns, it's Teaneck, it's Anglo, it's like
That's what it's like being British at NYU.
Right, exactly. Everybody's talking about these things and you're like, I don't know. And then I learned, I pick up patterns very quickly. So I was able to say like, oh, that girl went to Harova, I get it. And I was able to pick up the language very quickly, but the way that I see it is that I picked up a language. And it took me a little bit of time to pick up a language, and I'm very persistent. And so I just like go back to Chabad, and I do love Jewish geography only because I've lived in a lot of different Jewish communities. Lucky for me, I lived near, for anybody who knows, in Israel, a yeshuv called Chashmonaim, which is where all the New Jersey Jews go to live. So I had a lot of mutual contacts. It was great for me. So it felt like when I didn't have an in because I didn't go to seminary, I still had that thing. So I sort of capitalized on it in some way. So it was kind of a defense mechanism for me when I did feel like an outsider, where I felt like people saw me as an outsider. But I think what's really important is, I don't see my identity as intersectional at all. I see it as fully Jewish, and that's me. That's the way I was raised. That's the only community I've literally ever known. And I also think it's important to say that I had Friday night dinner with a guy who's got a fascinating story. He's Hasidish, and then he left, but now he's just a very buff man, and he works in Hatzalah here. Somebody came up to him, knocked on the windows. You work for Hatzalah? And he's buff, and he wears jeans and tight shirts. And he said, yeah. And the guy said, that's funny, you don't look Jewish. Meanwhile, this guy's white. He's from Seagate, Brooklyn. He sounds Hasidish, if you know what that sounds like. And I think it's really important to say that this does happen to me. This has happened to Aaron, and I don't want to diminish anybody's story for a second, but I do want to put it into perspective by saying that every person who does not fit into a mold that is the majority of a certain area, New York has its own majority Jewish population. It's very different than Kansas. I have not experienced any sort of othering in other places that I've lived in a more concentrated way or heightened way than I have in New York City. They love labels here more than anywhere I've ever experienced. Israel, it's like, people would say like, oh, you can rap like, oh, you know, Jay-Z, you can dance. And then I'd say no. And then it was like, on to the next thing. Because they're ignorant. They just don't know. It's not even, I don't see, it's not racist. They just have no idea. It's the only American Black population they know. So then it's on to the next. All Americans are rich. Turns out they're not. So like, they just have these associations with people because you just pick from whatever you have around. So I really hesitate to say that any sort of prejudice that I've experienced is racism, because racism is a really serious thing. And as far as I've experienced it, thank God in my life, I have never experienced racism. I've experienced a lot of stupidity, a lot of ignorance, but never racism. And I also think that it's important that to know that like my experience in the Jewish world is not different than a lot of other people. I know white converts, Hispanic converts who feel just as uncomfortable, and I really want to see past the color to see human experiences, because there's a lot of interconnectivity that gets lost in focusing on color, and I don't want to lose that. So I want to use this as an opportunity to say that.
So coming off of exactly that point, Kylie, you wrote an article about a month, 6 weeks ago, which you referenced at the start, and it got a lot of attention. And it had the provocative, certainly for the moment, and the intriguing title of "My Mum is White and My Dad is Black, Don't Call Me a Jew of Color." Could you just relate again here what your central argument was? Yeah,
so I mean, my central argument is that I have grown up Jewish. I've only known life as a Jew. And an American Jew at that. I define myself far more by my American identity, now more by my Jewish identity than my American than before, but still nonetheless very American. And to call me a Jew of color, and I will only say this personally because I know that this is a term that people feel very comfortable with, and I don't want to take away from that at all, but for myself, to call me a Jew of color is to define me by any negative moment that's happened in my life. To call me a Jew of color is to imply that I'm somehow other than everybody else. And I don't see myself as other, nor do I want to be treated as other. God forbid we make anybody else feel like there's somebody who doesn't fit in the Jewish community. So I don't see it as doing much for the sake of progress in the Jewish community and making people feel like they're a part of it. I see it as segregation. I see it as this person fits in here, this person fits in there, and just adding more labels to it. Segregation is an extremely loaded term, and I do not mean that in the loaded way that it comes off. I just mean that in grouping people into other status. The term Jew of color is also a massive term that encompasses people who are not Black. It encompasses people, I mean, if there's a poll that was taken, it encompasses people who identify as other. They can look white, but they're not, and they're not according to this term. And what it really captures is people who have historically been treated as other. And I don't want to be treated as other. I just want to be a Jew. I don't think that's too much to ask either.
So, hi, Kai, if I can push you on the argument a little bit, it's a very intriguing argument, and it's also a very beautiful argument when somebody hears it coming from you. Because if I understand you correctly, you're saying I'm Jewish, and any other thing that you add to that sort of like then seems to make me an item of interest, you know, separate from the Jewish community, and I just want to be Jewish. But it strikes me there's a little bit of a paradox in making the argument right now, because not many people are saying this, as far as I've seen. I mean, your article was widely shared because it was quite rare and challenging in saying I don't want the label of being a Jew of color. But if you'll forgive the clunky phrasing, it's precisely because you are a Jew with a Black parent that you have the ability or permission or the responsibility to say, don't call me a Jew of color.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, it's an uncomfortable paradox for me. And it's something that I'm still working out. I don't want to sound like delusions of self-grandeur. I do not have them, but I announced on my Facebook today to like my very few people who follow me, but that I sorry?
I'm one of them, I saw it.
Not to say they're not important people, just that the number is not massive by any means. I have no delusions of my importance, not that high. But yeah, I think in thinking about this, my initial goal for this was to say, there is a narrative out there. There is a narrative that somebody who looks like me must be called a Jew of color because that's how I want to be called if somebody sees me. I don't want to be called that if somebody sees me. So I wanted to contribute. I wanted to shift that narrative because I think that there should be additional voices in it. It kind of backfired a little bit. It kind of became, oh, right, so you are the Jew of color, you're the Black Jew who can speak to that with a different opinion. And I realized, like, oh, wait, this isn't what I was hoping for. I was just hoping to be Jewish. And now I'm speaking to things. And at first I saw it as an opportunity, and I was very excited by the opportunity to share my opinion and have a perspective on things that's different, because the world is made up of a multitude of different opinions. As the reason we're here is because no two people think alike, and that goes for the world. We're convinced that there's a monolith of thought because it's the loudest, but there's not. And I wanted to add a dissenting voice to that, or just another voice that happens to dissent. But at this point, after the reaction, I don't think that I will do another event that is labeled Black and Jewish anymore, because it's not me. And you're right, it is a paradox, and it's one that I don't want to give into. And I think one stands to lead more by example than from sort of within it. So my take on it now is that if somebody wants me to speak at an event as a Jew who's traveled around the world and who has hot takes on things or different opinions, so happy to do it. But as a Black Jew, that's just not who I am. And I leaned into it in the beginning because I think that language is something that is immensely important. Immensely. It's the reason the world was created with words. The pronoun movement has become so big because we recognize how important words are. But I feel like that's getting lost with the language of Jew of color and Black, because what it does is it takes away from somebody's culture and identity. Two people, a person from the West Indies and a person from Kenya and a person from Ghana don't have the same background. They have vastly different cultural heritages, but they're called Black. That's melting everything. So I thought I could change it from within, but I don't think that I can. So I give into the paradox. I say, yes, it is there. And I'm just going to focus on the Jewish thing now. For right now, I don't want to live in the paradox, and you're 100% right. It is a paradox.
So thank you so much for that. And Aaron, I guess I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on that and your response to that. You know, coming from a very different background, as Kylie does. Does the Jew of color label feel restrictive, or does it actually feel sort of empowering and validating?
It's the second one. Surprised, but I embrace the label because it's something I'm proud of. I think it's a good mix, because I do think of my two identities as intersectional. I do think that I'm not just a Jew. I'm not just a person of color. I'm a Jew of color, and I'm that and more. But I don't think that the Jew of color label is restrictive. I think if anything, it just acknowledges that Jews of color, I guess for those who take on the label, like have a different set of experiences and perspectives, and that honestly enrich the Jewish identity as a whole and contribute to the much larger conversation with Klal Israel. So I think one of the things that I read in the article is that, like, for you, Kylie, like, Jew of color is something that has like a negative experience or a negative connotation with it. And obviously I respect your opinion, and I understand why you would think that way, and why that would have a negative connotation. For me, being a Jew of color means having those negative experiences of being kind of different, of being a Black man in sometimes Ashkenazi or Ashkenazi normative Jewish spaces, and also being like, yeah, I'm different. But Judaism is not a monolith, and there are different types of Jews, and there's kind of different perspectives, and I think and there should be, I think, an acknowledgement of that, because I might need something, or I might need to be approached with I'm not saying like I need to be approached for my differences, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that just as everyone's different, I think people who are of color in spaces where they might be looked as either as not Jewish or as converts, or places as maybe that they're a threat. Like if they're in shul and there's something happening, they might assume that I'm the shooter or I'm the whatever or whatnot, rather than maybe a white shooter who's coming in. Like, I think that there's a little bit of care and sensitivity that has to go with that. I think ideally we would say, we're all Jews and we don't see color and we're all the same. And I'd love to be in that world. I just don't think that we're there yet. I don't think that we're there where people don't see color. I think that, we do have microaggressions and we do treat people differently with snap judgments. And I'm not saying that everyone's racist, but I'm saying that people look at each other and size each other up for not just race, but other things too. I know if you look at someone maybe with like dressed Hasidishly or with a black hat or whatnot, you might also make some snap judgments, and it's a little bit of similar kind of thing too. And just part of that is just acknowledging that and overcoming that so that we can, treat everyone with respect and dignity. But to do that, you have to say that everyone has different experiences and everyone might have a different, perspective or might have different needs, not necessarily that's less or more, but that's just, we're different. So we have to approach people differently. We might not have to ask that yeshiva question right off the bat, but we'll get to it.
So,
dude, can I just say also, I think it's really important to highlight that what it is that we're doing also is a part of solving the problem. And for everybody who is watching this, it is important to see that two people who don't agree can have a conversation and not necessarily have to come to the same side or like have a final agreement or be canceled afterwards. Like, the other thing that has really been lost is the art of dialogue. It's a term that's thrown around, but I think it's thrown around very loosely because people are not having conversations with people and approaching people with different opinions. And so I do also want to thank you, Rabbi Joe, for this space to have conversations that can be enhanced by people who have different opinions, because that's the way the world is. So I think it's a beautiful example of what we're striving for in the world.
Thank you both of you so much for that. I'm going to skip some of the questions that I'd written down, only because I want to make sure that we've got time for some of the questions that people had submitted in advance. People should feel free to write in the chat any questions they've got. It's already getting on, so we'll probably only have time for a couple of them. But I want to start with one that we received from someone who's on the call. She asked whether you think it does anyone any good when we compare the suffering of these two communities, of the Jewish community and the Black community. And then a second question was also asked, which is connected, so I think can ask it together. Both the Jewish and Black communities have a long, complicated history of trauma and persecution. And we know that trauma can be passed on from generation to generation, even if a descendant did not experience a trauma themselves. Do you think it's possible for either of these communities to heal from that generational trauma? Or will we continuously pass on that trauma to the next generations, even without necessarily experiencing persecution ourselves? And if you think that the answers to this question are different for Jewish and Black communities, please do explain. So big questions, but take a jump at it.
I can take a stab at, for sure, the second one. Like the first one I could talk about briefly, but I just want to also focus on the second one because I think, especially like recently, right, like we have anti-Semitic comments by Black celebrities and whatnot. And I think that there's also been like this divide as, as someone who defines himself as, a Black Jew of color, that, I kind of have like both my families here, I see that the Jewish people and Black people are kind of like co-neighbors in this struggle for equality after undergoing oppression and generational trauma, I think, as the questioner had posed. So do I think that when trauma is passed down from generation to generation, we can heal, or even if we don't experience it ourselves? I think absolutely. I think from even before I was Jewish, but certainly now, like my grandma my grandma grew up in the South. She grew up in North Carolina, and she would tell me stories about how in the South she couldn't enter through the front door for her white neighbors, in the front door of the house. She had to go around to the back. And then she kept on saying how she never wanted to go to the South. It was racist there. And even now things had changed, she didn't want to go because it really affected the way that she would act around other people, because she was degraded as a person. And so, but I carry that, and I carry her story with me. But even though I didn't experience that, I think that I both carry that, but also realize I'm a dentist, I'm a doctor, I'm the first doctor in my family, but I'm also had come from someone who wasn't able to enter the front door of a person's house, you know, and I carry that, and those are both, you know, both it's all part of my story, and I feel like it's like kind of like a tikkun, like it's kind of like healing, but it's like you have to have both. Like you have to have like your Masorah, you have to have like acknowledgement, especially around Tisha B'Av, right? You have to have this moment where you're like, the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, and I have this, you know, we have this sadness, you know, but like we can go from here, even though we don't have it, we can both remember it, experience it, and try to find out how to make the world a better place. I think as the, you know, as our obligation as Jews, you know, it's like the Reform movement kind of took the Tikkun Olam, but I think that obviously it come from like the mono-Orthodox perspective, just the fact that we have individual responsibility, and yeah, that part of that is just knowing your history and carrying that with you. It's part like carrying that also can heal it in a way. Like you have to, but you can't run away from your history or your truth or the bad experiences. You have to just carry that with you, and it's going to be difficult, but you know, that's how you can heal, and that's how you can grow, and that's how we can all grow as communities, both Black and Jewish.
Thank you so much, Aaron. How about you, Kylie?
I think with regard to the first question, can we compare the two sufferings? I think absolutely. I think to look at a perfect example of this is the relationship between Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel. If you want to see two people who connected through their connection and relationship to God, but also through shared trauma. There's been a lot of history. I thought I was going to do my doctorate on the relationship between Black communities and Jewish communities. So I did a little bit of preliminary research on this topic, just going into grad school and an undergrad. But I think that what's really important in having conversations about the sufferings of particular communities is context, because suffering is a human phenomenon at its core. It is done at the hands of somebody else, and it's something that people around the world have experienced. There are people who are imprisoned right now in China because of their religion, and if we don't compare our suffering to them, we're letting what happened to us happen again. And we need to see ourselves in that broader context, because that's the way we saved the world. Like, that's what we're supposed to do here. We're supposed to treat people with kindness because we were once slaves. That's built into the Torah. See yourself in your own context and treat people on the basis of that. It's the key to who we are. It's the crux of it. And then with regard to trauma, I mean, that's such a big question that I think psychologists have spent a very long time thinking about. There's a lot of books on trauma and the way that's passed down generationally. There's a really beautiful line from this psychologist named Esther Perel. She grew up she's fantastic, highly recommend for anybody looking for relationship advice, but also at a broader level, her experience in terms of sociology and just her life. She grew up in Belgium, and she's the child of Holocaust survivors. And she did her own sort of study just through her life of seeing the types of Holocaust survivors and the families who thrive and those who do not thrive. And she says, some people survive and some people thrive again. There are those who are not dead. Some people there are still alive, but they just see themselves as not dead. So there's the alive and thriving, and there's the surviving and not dead. And I think that with every trauma, we have different ways of responding to it, but I think the healthiest way is to see it as a part of us, as a defining part of us, but to be focused on thriving again, because we are humans put here on earth to do something, and if we let trauma be something that holds us back from fulfilling our purpose, well, it's a loss to the world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Kylie, and thanks both of you. Just to take one more question, which was submitted, and I did just check with Aaron that he is comfortable speaking about it. But Sarah asks, Aaron, if you are comfortable, how or if your conversion changed your relationship with your family?
It didn't for my mom and my brother. Like, it was an adjustment period at first. Of course, when I say, hey guys, I'm like, want to convert to Orthodox Judaism, it's like, wait, what are you talking about? So my father, it took some time because he was raised Catholic and was a lay Catholic until he started, seeing me like, looking at a Siddur and learning Hebrew and then pulling out the film, and he was like, wait, what's going on? What about like, Jay and whatnot? Like, don't you want to be saved? And I'm like, Dad, what are you talking about? So that was hard, and that took some time. It definitely took a couple months and a couple conversations. Just it was mostly like he was wanting to make sure he didn't lose me and whatnot, and I think that's mostly where that came from. But most of the work I had done. So it's like, for food, I was like, guys, don't worry. Like, I koshered the oven and like just prepared all this stuff. So like that was fine. And, obviously people felt that, like for, Thanksgiving and whatnot, like we like modified some things, but essentially it put a strain. But because I was able to just kind of communicate that this was so important to me, and that my family just like loved me, that they were okay to be like, okay, well, we want to go out, we'll go to a kosher restaurant, like, and like that, and they were totally okay with it. Like, it took some adjustments, but now we're all on the same page and whatnot. And I'm actually lactose intolerant, so my brother, when I introduced the idea of parv to him, he was like, Aaron, like, where did we know? Like, I should have known about this from like day one. Like, 9 dairy cakes that are amazing. I was like, John, well, so it's an instant win with him. So, it was a rough adjustment period, but no, thank God it was fine.
Thank you. So I want to have the last question as my own one, which is that, you are both people who deeply love Torah and Torah study, and we experience the world through the Torah that we learn and that we share. And this time tomorrow is Tisha B'Av. It's the darkest day of the Jewish calendar, and it's a moment when our tradition pushes us to reflect upon how we can heal some of the fractures in our world. And I wondered if to conclude the evening, if both of you had any sort of Torah thoughts which are on your mind, which you'd like to share at this point.
Aaron, you go first.
Okay, so my wife, my awesome Asia Kyle, was actually last Shabbat talking about Erica Brown's book for Tisha B'Av, like preparing for the 3 weeks. And she was talking about something that Dr. Erica Brown had said that really was salient to me. She was saying how Erica Brown wrote that suffering humanizes us and ignoring suffering dehumanizes us. And as I was thinking about like what the piece of Torah for Tisha B'Av, I couldn't think of anything better, because I think that, like, who really wants to hang on to suffering? Who wants to hang on to trauma? And how could that be a good thing? And yet it's, I think it's just an important piece on, the fact that this is what makes us human. Like, it's part of our burden, and yet it's also part of what makes us strong and what makes us, I would say, great. And having that compassion, as Kylie had put, just re-emphasizing the emphasis on the Torah, that we have to, treat people with dignity, that we have to remember that we were slaves in Egypt, protect our neighbor. We should, treat the neighbor with dignity and respect. These are constant things that kind of put us in our place in terms of like a humility standpoint. And just also quickly, like, I have to also just throw this in. There's a part, I think it was Korach. It has to be Korach, which I was also thinking of. It's I don't remember specifically what it is, but I remember Korach and his cohort were like challenging Moshe and Aaron for their place, and Moshe, at some point, someone in their cohort is offering an offering, and Moshe turns to Hashem and says, "Do not turn to his offering." Like, he's like worried, like, I did not do anything to harm them. Like you have this, like Moshe Rabbeinu is like what? It's like that just on top of the world. Like, you know, it's just to have him just be worried that Hashem, who like would turn to someone else, and that like it just shows like the absolute you know, indicative of his humility, and shows an example for us to that if you think you have it in the bag or whatnot, that you have to always just keep like just know your place, and your place is you're an Eved Hashem, and that means that we're kind of having to be the light to the nations. We have to serve our communities and keep talking and to help one another and to help, you know, make a positive impact on this world. And so, you know, that's both the suffering part and also the humility part, I think, was just what came to mind.
Thank you so much, Aaron. How about you, Kylie?
Well, I do have to say, as a Jewish academic in the making, or an academic, both Jewish academic and academic of Jewish studies in the making, Moses Mendelssohn, an 18th century German Jewish philosopher and theologian, and Samson Raphael Hirsch to follow, 19th century German Jewish philosopher and theologian, explained that suffering is education. It's a means of education. And so if we see it as something negative, that kind of takes away from it. We're supposed to learn from it. And it's what's given to us to move us to the next stage and advance us on the ladder of perfection, if you're going to use his language, which I think is a very beautiful idea. But on the topic of Tisha B'Av is something I've always struggled with a lot. It's something that we are told you must care about. Not only must you care about it, but you must cry over it and feel like you're in mourning, and you're going to sit on the floor like you're in Avel, and you're going to be in a state of mourning for something that happened thousands of years ago that I don't connect to at all. It's always been, I think the deepest Tisha B'Av I ever had was when I watched the first season of Fauda, and I was just in awe. I was like, this horrible situation, and this hatred is a product of that. And that was the time that I connected most, but I don't want to have to watch Fauda every time I want to connect. And I don't even think I would connect to it in the same way this time. But in preparation for this year, in thinking about what it means to fast, what it means to mourn, what I'm realizing is that, and what I've been learning is that it actually, I think in some ways has less to do with suffering, qua suffering, as this experience of feeling like we are in mourning over something that happened and just sad about it. There's nothing productive, I think, about being sad about something, especially something we can't really connect to. But rather, this day as a fast day is one that we're meant to look inside of ourselves and see how we can fix the events that led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the beginning of the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks began, Shivas Arba Tammuz began with the golden calf. What was that? That was the Jews not trusting in God. That was needing something to comfort them when their sort of human savior of sorts, the person who was going to lead them to the promised land, didn't come exactly when they expected him to come. And out of that fear, they needed something to soothe that. And so we are picking up the pieces from that every single year. And fast days are not days where we're just not eating. If you just do that, and maybe you go to shul, you're missing the whole point of it, I believe. I think the point of it is to do the hard introspective work to see where in our lives we don't have trust in God and we're not giving up what it is that we're doing for God. And to do the work to see where can we fix the pieces that were broken when Moses threw the 2 tablets on the ground and broke them. And where can we open up our hearts and our souls to allow for more love to come in so that we're not committing the same sin of sinat chinam, of baseless hatred in our lives. It is a day of introspection. It's not a day of fasting. Fasting is just the means that we do it because pleasure is something that's very distracting as food, and food is a major source of pleasure. So I hope that everybody takes the opportunity to do the work of Tisha B'Av more than just fasting on Tisha B'Av.
Thank you so much, Kylie. Thank you so much to both of you for everything that you've shared tonight and for your willingness to come on. I remember a few months ago, a friend of mine saying that he really feels that America could really do with adopting certain parts of the Jewish calendar. That, you know, there's 3 weeks to think about, you know, the darkest parts of our history, and there's a whole month to think about moving ourselves to a better place. And I really feel that tonight we've done something of combining the American calendar with the Jewish calendar in that way. So perhaps to finish, if I can ask everyone to unmute themselves and just to collectively say a huge thank you to Aaron. Unmute yourself and put your video on as well, and to say a huge thank you to Aaron and Kylie for everything that they shared with us.
Put my video.
Thank you, Aaron and
Thank
Kylie.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you everybody for for joining. It's been really tremendous. Wishing everybody all the best if you're fasting, and everyone to be well and be safe.